Hello, and welcome to your Decentralized State Systems lecture. This is something new that the College Board has added to the curriculum for the new rewrite from 2016-2017. So this information is something that may be reviewed in other lectures as well, so keep that in mind as we go through this information. Your key concept for this one is 3.2i, which states that empires collapsed and were reconstituted. In some regions, new state forms emerged. And what they wanted you to discuss here is the decentralized government's feudal systems in both Europe and Japan. So this lecture is going to talk about the development of feudalism and kind of how Europe ended up becoming centralized during this time period, and Japan actually goes the opposite direction. It was more centralized and fell into feudalism by the end of this time period. Feudalism, just as a base definition, is a series of social and economic relationships that led to an organized political system, and that political system can exist without any type of centralized power. While a lot of times there was a centralized power in name, that centralized power actually didn't exercise or use any of the powers that it technically had. The social and economic relationships developed out of this economic system called the manorialism, or the manor. So the manor house is basically a way to survive in the post-Roman era. So the key, whenever we see an empire fall, a major empire fall, something like Rome, we're going to see the collapsing of centralized systems, and the basic needs are not going to be met anymore by a centralized state. So it means that the citizens in these areas have to find a new way and a new system to meet their basic needs. And for Europe, they used the manor house as a way to do that. So this power vacuum in Europe leads to localization of basic needs and lessening of trade amongst all the different areas. So during this early time period of the feudal system, people would very rarely travel like more than 5 miles from their home. As we go throughout the unit, as we get closer to the Renaissance era, obviously trade is kind of revitalized, especially with the Mongols coming in the late 1200s. Japan obviously had just started to create enough of a population to even need any type of centralized system. We have not talked about Japan yet, simply because it was very environmentally difficult to create any type of farming system. And so as a result, we have low population numbers for the islands that we call Japan today. So as we get into the Japanese feudalism towards the end of the lecture, you'll see what I mean there as far as increasing the population, leading to the need for some type of centralized system. So going into Europe first, you have this hierarchical social economic system where on the bottom you have your laboring class. Your laboring class does not include just farming. So we still have some artisans like your blacksmiths or different things of that nature that are still that are still actually making products. But again, those products have become more localized and more specialized in regards to these different areas. As well, the artisans and whatnot that are part of this laboring class are not considered higher up in the social ladder simply because everything is localized and they're not selling their goods on a mass market like we had in the previous time period with the Silk Road system. So you had 3 options if you were a laboring class. You could have been a slave, you could have been a serf, and you could have been a peasant. For the slavery and serfdom, there's really not a huge difference. A lot of times your slaves were, at this point in time, more based off of an ethnicity. So a lot of people were enslaved due to conquering or things of that nature from the previous time period. And that slave status is going to be hereditary. And that is just something that is pre-existing that just continues throughout this era. Serfdom is something new. Serfdom develops out of the feudal system for debtors, and families become in debt for various reasons, and they end up being tied to the land that is owned by some type of lord or vassal, and that position is also hereditary. So again, a lot of times your serf were not necessarily associated with conquering or associated with any type of ethnic issues in regards to the difference between serfdom and slavery. Now your peasant is a free laborer. However, free is a very limited term during this time period because you don't own any land, you have some new rights and privileges, and the opportunity for peasants to perhaps increase out of the laboring classes available to them on a limited scale, but they were just a little bit better off than the serfs. Your next level in the feudal system is your knight or your vassal. They're allied to someone of a higher rank somewhere along the way, and they owed loyalty to someone because they earned a piece of land that we call a fief or a fief. And this fiefdom is basically just the way that you end up creating their own economics, their own power. These knights and vassals usually were traveling with the person of that higher rank, whether that was the noble or the monarch, and they actually had someone called a bailiff who would run his own land, and that's where we get that term. A lot of times those bailiffs were peasants that managed to kind of raise themselves up in the ranks within that geographical area. And so that's what I meant by the peasant being able to kind of manipulate their social system a little bit. Obviously, the knight and the vassals were the ones who were trained for military purposes. Everybody above the laboring class were trained for military, and there was constant fighting amongst the different nobility throughout this era. And then, of course, you have towards the end of it with the development of the Crusades. The noble is the person who owned the land, but that land ownership is a little bit unclear because of the idea of the monarch and the idea of kingship, and so it's going to be different in each state, and we're going to talk about some of the different geographical areas for later in the lecture. The noble is basically had to protect his laborers and protect the people that were working on his manor, and that's where that relationship comes in. The feudal system is really about the relationships between each one of these hierarchical levels, and most of the time this relationship is these relationships were laid out in some type of contract, and those contracts were written and maintained by the Catholic Church. The noble was a vassal who basically earned a lot of land or had earned favor of some type of monarch, and so it was just kind of an elevated vassal. So nobles at one point were also knights and kind of a minor vassal, and each country will create different titles for all these different levels. The monarch was the top noble, a noble who was able to use divine right in some way or form and manages to get the blessing of the church, and they end up getting a title called king, and that's kind of how we create that monarch system. Again, it's different in each state, and we'll look at that as we go throughout the lecture. The church is also super important in regards to this era for feudalism in Europe, and they actually had their own hierarchy. So at the bottom, the laboring class were found in your monasteries. So in your monasteries is where your monasteries would each kind of specialize in something. There are some monasteries that were beer making. In fact, the Artois family of beers is actually an ancient monastery, not ancient, I guess, from the Middle Ages that developed throughout this time period. A lot of your modern day beer companies that originate in Europe were developing out of this monastery system during this era. The head of the monastery was called the abbot, and it's just kind of the head monk. The monasteries will operate economically independently from the state and from any control over any noble or any type of vassal, and they would provide the basic needs for the church, the heads of the church. Your priest is the one who interacted with the people, with most of the citizens in the different areas, and they performed all your ceremonies and sacraments that were required of the Catholic Church, and they were in charge of what was called a cathedral. So we now have these cathedrals being built, and it was just your local church. So the priests were separate from the monasteries in that they actually interacted with societies, with people in society, where the monks never and the nuns never actually really interacted with people outside of their monastery walls. Bishops were appointed by the Pope, and they were in charge of several priests and several different, basically what we call a diocese, and they were handpicked by the Pope for the most part, and there's actually conflict in some of the states between the bishops and the appointment of bishops between the Pope and the King. Archbishops were in charge of a larger form of a diocese, and they answer directly to the Pope. So an archbishop is an elevated bishop, and then of course your cardinals were specially chosen bishops that were kind of advisors to the Pope. The cardinals usually lived with the Pope in the Vatican City, the area that will ultimately become the Vatican City, with the Bishop of Rome. And the cardinals were just advisors. And like I said, they were just bishops or archbishops that the Pope liked and that they were friends with. And then, of course, the head of the church during this time period is titled the Pope, and he's elected by the cardinals. Most of the time, your Pope was probably already a cardinal or at least an archbishop. So here's just a graphic that kind of gives you an idea that compares what was going on within the feudal system. So at the top you have the Pope and the church, and the Pope would crown the monarchs who had a series of nobles. Those nobles had their own knights and vassals that they were loyal to. And then, of course, underneath them you have your laboring class of your merchants, your farmers, your peasants, your serfs, and your craftsmen. And again, this is a localized economic system. There's not massive trade during this time period, at least until the end of the feudal age. So going into the specific states, we're going to talk about feudal England first. The king was an absolute ruler who actually owned all the land, and he would grant access to that land to those who were loyal to him. And he didn't necessarily have to be militarily loyal, especially as we get into the Renaissance era, but the people who were given the lands or the manors were somehow directly related to the king in some regards. Not necessarily like family. Family obviously would be more important, but the different something. To own land in England from the king, you did something good for him. The first true king of what we call England is William of Normandy. He unites most of the island in 1066 at the Battle of Hastings, and he's going to be the first to really organize the British people into some type of census. The census was called the Domesday Book, and the whole point of the Domesday Book was for taxation. William of Normandy is actually British. The Normandy, or actually French. Normandy is actually a territory in France, and the kings of England were vassals to the king of France for a lot of history. And the royals actually spoke French. They didn't even speak English. We will be, some of you will be reading an article about the development of the English language that kind of gives you an idea of why the why the British kings spoke French, not English. One of the big turning points for feudal England is the Magna Carta, which was signed in 1215 under King John. King John was on the throne because Richard the Lionheart went out on the Third Crusade, and he was a horrible, horrible king. He overtaxed everybody to the point where there was a rebellion called the Runnymede Rebellion, and the nobles end up writing this document saying that the king cannot tax without permission of the nobility. And as a result of that, we get what's called Parliament. And Parliament is kind of our first legislative assembly in Europe, where the nobles would get together and vote on things, and it's mainly taxation. And as a result of that, this weakens the kingship for the British forever. In fact, that's why King John doesn't have any Roman numerals, because he really kind of messed things up for the British monarchy. They're going to be under the control of the nobility as a result, rather than the other way around. Another important event for feudal England is the 100 Years' War. The 100 Years' War was a series of battles as the English kings tried to maintain geographic holdings in France. You can see on the map to the left where you can see the areas. The purple areas were controlled by the English at some point, and so the 100 Years' War was sometimes a king would become aggressive, or even a noble would become aggressive and within France and try to kind of regain some of that French territory, and ultimately the English will be completely kicked off the continent by the end of the 100 Years' War. Because of this, both the French crown and the British crown will become more centralized as they were fighting over territory. So the effects of the 100 Years' War was creating a more centralized government for both France and for England. As far as the Catholic Church goes for England, there's a couple different things that you need to know. One is the issue with Thomas Becket. Henry II, King Henry, issues what's called the Constitutions of Clarendon, which basically said that he was trying to separate the Church of England from the Pope, and the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Becket, didn't like that, and he spoke out against Henry II, and ultimately Henry II's knights are going to assassinate Thomas Becket, and so what we see is this huge conflict between the power of the Church and the power of the King, and when the king assassinates the Archbishop of Canterbury, basically what we're seeing is where the British king is going to kind of become more powerful than the Pope within this territory. In 1215, the Magna Carta was signed, and basically part of that issue was that King John didn't like who the Pope had appointed as Archbishop of Canterbury. So the Pope placed England under what's called interdict. An interdict is where the priests are not allowed to perform any of the sacraments or any of the ceremonies required by the Catholic Church. And within Catholicism, if you miss those practices and you miss those ceremonies, it has a huge impact on your afterlife and your ability to get out of purgatory, which is kind of like this, for lack of a better explanation, this waiting room to get into heaven in that oneness with God in the afterlife. And so for this time period of King John's reign, nobody was able to actually be baptized or get married or have last rites or do their first communion or anything associated with the sacraments of the Catholic Church. So this is another reason why the nobles are going to rebel against King John. They were mad about taxation, but they were also mad about this interdict that the Pope had placed on England. So as a result, King John was forced to sign the Magna Carta, which stated that the Church of England was to be free from interference from the crown and actually have closer ties to the papacy. So the Pope actually wins here. The Pope actually reestablishes his control a little bit after this Thomas à Becket affair with the Magna Carta. Of course, Henry VIII will ultimately split the British Church from the Catholic Church entirely in 1534, but that's more in the next time period, and we'll talk about that Reformation when we get into the next unit. For France, France is not centralized at all. Clovis I is going to unite the Frankish tribes. If you remember from the end of Rome, we have a bunch of Germanic tribes controlling what the Romans called Gaul. And the Clovis I is really considered our first French king, and he's going to unite a bunch of the tribes in the 6th century, but that is super short-lived. Charles Martel is another, he's from the line of Clovis, and he's going to use the feudal system to unify the knights, and this is a hugely important, Charles Martel is hugely important for Catholic Europe, because at the Battle of Tours in 732, he and the other feudal knights are going to be able to defeat the Muslims and going to stop the expansion of the Umayyad into Europe as a whole. So this battle is super, super important into preserving the Catholic Church from Muslim invasion. We do have a series of family called the Carolinians, and they ruled out of France from 800 to 888. Charlemagne is the first, considered the first person to be crowned by the papacy in the year 800. It was actually Christmas Day in the year 800. Unfortunately, the Carolinians are not able to maintain control, and the land that we today call France was split into a bunch of independent duchies, or basically manors, and they were fighting constantly throughout the Middle Ages. They would unite for battles with the 100 Years' War, but then break up again right away. The lords were basically had their own rights, and they actually managed to expand serfdom in France. Serfdom was a huge kind of a labor. It's hugely important to the labor needs for France, not so much in England. England doesn't have as many serfs as France does. Threats of the English in the 100 Years' War led to a more centralized system, like I said, and the lords had to unite to defend their land from the British. Throughout the 13th century, the smaller states start to lose power to a centralized royal family called the Valois, and the Valois will manage to kind of create a more centralized system. You can see on the map of the left, you can see all the different duchies and the different kind of control, and ultimately this whole territory will eventually become France in our next time period. One of the biggest things for France is plague. Once plague hits France very, very hard, and it wipes out the laboring class and will ultimately end serfdom. When you have a lack of laborers can start demanding things like wages, and so that's why serfdom will ultimately end for Europe, is because of plague. For the Holy Roman Empire, the Holy Roman Empire is very complicated. It's not holy, it's not Roman, and it's not actually an empire. Charlemagne was crowned the first Holy Roman Emperor by the Pope in 800, and this title managed to remain in place in Europe until 1806. Napoleon will actually end the Holy Roman Emperorship. The Holy Roman Emperor was elected throughout 800 to 1806, and it was elected by basically the dukes and the nobles throughout all the different what we call Germanic states. You can see this map on the left as it goes through what states were part of the Holy Roman Empire and what states were not part of the Holy Roman Empire, starting in 962 all the way up to 1806. In the 13th century, we create the College of Electors, and the College of Electors is basically where they actually started electing the Holy Roman Emperor, and very specific families dominated this title. So you have the Hohenstaufens for a lot of the 1,000-year history, but you will also need to know the Habsburgs. The Habsburgs are going to be unbelievably important when you take AP European history next year, so you definitely need to know that name. The Habsburgs will hold on to the title for a large portion of the existence of the Holy Roman Empireship. As far as the church goes, one of the biggest problems is the investiture controversy. So in the Holy Roman Empire, the kings, nobles, dukes usually appointed their own bishops. Pope Gregory VII didn't like this, and so he actually starts to kind of get aggressive about appointing the bishops within the Holy Roman Empire. Well, King Henry IV didn't like that either. So what he did was he got his bishops to excommunicate the Pope. Well, the Pope in turn excommunicated the king. And as a result of that, if you are under this king, then that means that you do not have access to heaven. You do not have access to the sacraments. And again, it's a lot like interdict. And so in 1122, the Concordat of Worms was signed by Henry V, which basically stated that the Pope would be appointing the bishops for the German states for the rest of history, which they did. The Hanseatic League is this interesting thing that was unique to Europe. It's a series of cities along the Baltic that were independently politically, but they owe their allegiance to the Holy Roman Empire. So this is the feudal system. The Hanseatic League was technically under the Holy Roman Emperor, and the Holy Roman Empire would protect the Hanseatic League from people like the Vikings or anybody else who came into the region. But at the same time, it was an economic alliance of these series of cities that you can see here on the map to the left. And they protected the guilds and they protected the economics of this region. Each city had their own military that they would ally together if necessary, which oftentimes they had to, especially against the people like the Vikings. And each city had their own political system that operated pretty much independently. But if the Holy Roman Empire needed them, then they would work with Holy Roman Emperor and vice versa. And the major economic power was in its monopoly on shipbuilding, which makes sense because they were along the Baltic Sea. And you can see the different cities that were going to be super important to this era. When you guys you're going to do a city project in the third quarter. Some of these cities are actually in that project, so you'll see how the Hanseatic League impacted the urbanization of these cities. And of course, you see London on there. London ultimately becomes the capital of England, and it was part of the Hanseatic League in regards to economics, but it was a little bit different in regards to its relationship due to the centralized British king. Italy was unique in regards to how it fit into all of this because it's a series of independent areas. Sometimes it was ruled by the Ostrogoths. Sometimes it was part of the Byzantine Empire. Sometimes the Holy Roman Emperor controlled it. Sometimes the French controlled it. At one point, all of southern Italy was controlled by the Spanish. So these territories were constantly changing hands. By the end of the Middle Ages, we have this series of city-states where they are operating independently. Because of the economic trade that revitalizes in the end of the Middle Ages, Milan, the Papal States, Venice, Florence, Naples, and of course Venice are all going to be, with the Ottomans, which we kind of talked about a little bit, are going to be kind of their own independent city-states that are going to operate on their own, but sometimes they get conquered, sometimes they fight with one another, and sometimes they're completely independent. So the Italian Peninsula is basically a big mess. Italy will not be one big country until 1861. So it takes a very long time for the Italian city-states to actually, in these regions, to become unified. Something that's important during this time period, that will impact the next time period is this Italian Wars. So during the Renaissance era that we'll talk about in the next time period, the different city-states were constantly fighting, like I said. As far as the church goes, because obviously the Pope lived in Rome, there's this time period called the Avignon or Babylonian captivity, which lasted from 1309 to 1377. Clement V was elected Pope, but he was French, so he didn't want to move to Rome. So he stayed in Avignon in France, and you can see on the map to the left where Avignon is. It's in southern France, which is actually a very important territory for wine. In fact, to this day, there are wines that have the seal of the papacy from this time period. This is going to weaken Rome economically and politically on a large scale, and causes serious problems for the Italian peninsula. The Pope, basically, during what we call the Avignon captivity, the Pope was being controlled by the French king. Obviously, the British don't like this, the Holy Roman Empire doesn't like this, and a lot of other areas just really don't like that the control of the French king over the Pope. And so, ultimately, one of the popes, Gregory the 11th, decides that he doesn't want to be under control of the French king, and he moves back to Rome. What ends up happening is another schism. We call this the Western Schism of 1378. Sometimes you see this as a Great Schism as well, but I don't want you to confuse that with the schism in 1054. The cardinals are loyal to different kings, and so the cardinals end up electing two different popes. So for a while, there were two popes running around. From 1378 until 1417, there were two popes running around. One was living in Avignon, one was living in Rome. England was allied to the one in Rome, and was supporting the guy in Rome, where the French were allying the one in Avignon, and you also had the issue of the 100 Years' War going on at the exact same time. So it was a big mess. This weakens the political power of the Pope greatly, and from this point forward, we're going to see the popes trying to stay in power politically, but ultimately it's going to fail. The Avignon captivity ends with an election of a third guy named Urban V, who will take the papacy in 1377. He was actually Italian, so it made sense that he would live in Rome. Moving over to Japan, we have a couple different periods that we like to discuss in regards to periodization for the Japanese feudal age. First is the Nara period, which was from 710 to 794. It was very agriculturally based, very old school village based, like Neolithic village based, and they practiced Shinto, which is your nature-based religion. And the capital city looked just like the Chinese cities of Chang'an. So the Buddhism has made its way into Japan at this point, and it's impacting life and the practice of Shintoism in the Japanese territory. The emperor and the royal family started to set themselves apart from the rest of the Japanese in this period and really actually isolate themselves in the palace, which is going to lead into the next era. And the court families start to fight for influence, which leads to the Heian period for the Japan. So the Heian era lasts from 794 to 1185, and when we're talking about these eras, we're actually talking about the capital city. So the emperor becomes more of a figurehead during this era, and the Fujiwara family was actually in charge. So the emperor is hanging out in his palace. We know about what was happening in the palace because of a story called the Tale of Genji, and we'll be watching a video on the Tale of Genji in class so you kind of get an idea of what that was about. And the aristocratic families were doing their own thing and kind of running their own feudal system. At this point, we have huge influences from Buddhism, Confucianism, and Taoism, and we start to get this warrior class that increases in importance because the court families were fighting so much. So that warrior class will ultimately become the samurai, or that idea of the knight level within the kind of comparing to the European system. There's a huge population increase during the Heian era, which leads to the need for more centralization and more fighting because, again, Japan is very resource poor. It's volcanic rock, so it's very difficult to grow things in Japan. And the more their population increases, the more difficult it is to meet those economic needs. The period that we call medieval Japan lasts from 1185 to 1543, and the emperors lost all political influence at this point. And what we call the nobles, or the daimyos, were in constant competition with one another for resources and power and control. And as a result, each daimyo family would have their own warrior class, which we call the samurai. This is very similar to the feudal system in Europe. The economy had turned into a true manorial system at this point. Rice was the only currency for the Japanese, as the government stopped minting coins altogether because there was no centralized government. And the emperor from this point forward and up until World War II is just a figurehead for the Japanese. Here's kind of a graphic on the different systems. So you had this emperor at the head who was this political figurehead who had no responsibilities, and he could appoint what was called the shogun. The shogun is kind of like the head daimyo, and fighting over that position was constant throughout the feudal age. The emperor also will be considered a spiritual leader, but he was never seen in public. He never left the palace. It wasn't like he was the Pope or the kings of Europe. So where in Britain or even in France, the king would literally be out there fighting with them. That's not going to happen in Japanese feudalism at all. The shogun is considered the military leader of Japan, and the shogun was only necessary when there was an outside invasion. And for the most part, there's not any outside invasions during the medieval era of Japan because China was dealing with the Mongols. The only people that would even attempt to invade Japan would be the Chinese, but because the Chinese were dealing with the Mongols, it's just not going to happen. There is one instance where Kublai Khan is going to attempt to take out Japan, but instead there was a tsunami that wiped him out, and so he was the Japanese island was protected from Mongol invasion. The daimyo are your nobles, just like in Europe, and they were the landowners, and they would provide troops to the shogun if necessary, but they really controlled their own warrior class, which we called the samurai. The samurai owed their loyalty to a daimyo, not to the Japanese state, which is very different than what we see in centralized systems, where the military owed their loyalty to the state. This is something that the Japanese are going to be able to change later, which really makes the Japanese military super strong and super loyal, which is something that is really impressive that the Japanese are going to be able to change for their system once we get into like World War I and World War II. Then, of course, you have your laboring class, which is your merchants, which are the merchants are on the lowest level due to the Confucian influence, and then, of course, your peasants are slightly above that. The Bushido code for the samurai was basically your unspoken way of life, where in Europe the feudal system was a bunch of signed contracts. We don't see these signed contracts in the Japanese feudal system at all. So here's a comparison between the Japanese and European feudal systems. They're both hereditary systems. They both had warrior classes, and those warrior classes had some type of codes. For the Japanese, it was called Bushido. For Europe, it was called chivalry. The chivalric code is, the damsels in distress, and you owe your loyalty to the noble, and knights in shining armor, and all that kind of stuff. They're both based on the economic idea of the manor or this manorial system. The nobility class was pretty much constantly at war with one another. Like I said, for Europe, there were times where the nobles would unite against the Muslims or against the Vikings or when they go to fight the Crusades. But for the most part, those moments were isolated. And of course, sometimes if they were fighting each other, like in the 100 Years' War. The land grants were given for loyalty, and so that is something that's similar between the two systems. And during this time period, we have very unique literature and culture. The European literature and culture we don't really actually have enough time to get into. We will touch on a little bit for the Renaissance era, but the literature and the art for the European feudal system, if you're interested in that kind of stuff, you would want to take AP Art History, and you can learn a little bit more about that. As far as differences, there's ritual suicide for the Japanese samurai, where if they did not fulfill the Bushido code, then they would kill themselves. That's not something that's encouraged in Europe. Suicide is seen as a negative thing within Catholicism, and so you're never going to have that system within Europe. The kings in Europe had a lot more political power than the emperor in Japan. Ultimately, the feudal system was a little bit more centralized, especially towards the end of the Middle Ages, where Japan, it kind of went backwards. Europe has a very higher influence by religion. There's a constant struggle between church and state, like we talked about with interdict or the lay investiture controversy, or ultimately when King Henry splits off from the Catholic Church. The merchants had more social value than peasants in Europe, and that was the exact opposite in Japan, where the peasants had a higher importance in the social ladder than merchants. And Europe slowly built into more of a centralized system, where Japan was forced into centralization due to foreign invasions. The European centralized states were solidified during the Renaissance era, which we will not discuss here, but we will touch on it a little bit in the next unit. And that is where AP European history starts for you next year, is when those states start to centralize. And Japan centralizes 100% simply because they were going to be invaded by the Chinese. So that's it for this lecture. I hope you enjoyed it. Have a good night.